Fantastic. So I'll move on to the agenda. So I'll firstly start off with some background on the LeafMarque standard consultation to explain what we're trying to achieve with this and further information. And then I'll give an overview of the two topics that we're addressing today and how we approach the consultation process before going into more detail of the LeafMarque standard changes and what we're proposing. That will take around 20 minutes, and then the last half an hour of the meeting or the webinar is optional for you to attend. For those that would like to ask questions, provide feedback, then please do stay along for that section, because we'll have plenty of time to answer any questions and to have a gauge of how you think of those changes and what you think of what we've done. So firstly then, the LeafMarque standard consultation. So this is our opportunity to gain stakeholders' feedback on the changes that we've made to the LeafMarque standard in our current revision process. So the deadline is the 17th of January for feedback, and there's a few ways that you can get involved. The simplest and the way that I would recommend is to complete one of our surveys. So we have either a detailed survey or a short survey, but they're targeted questions against the main changes that we've included in the LeafMarque standard version 16 draft. We also have a supporting summary of changes. So if you just want to have a quick overview of what's changed without having to look through the whole draft standard, then I'd recommend having a look at either of the summaries. And again, we either have a detailed summary or a more condensed summary, and that can help support in informing your answers to those questions in the survey. And we would really appreciate your feedback within that format, because it means we can collate it in a way that makes it more, we can collate comments together and get a general idea of what the feedback is. But there are other ways to get involved. This webinar is one of the strategies, because we have that section at the end where we'll be taking feedback from the group. But equally, if you just have any general comments that you'd like to send to us, so either ringing myself or Jenna, emailing myself or Jenna, and you could even post a letter to us. So we want it to be accessible to all of our stakeholders as possible. So the format that works best for you, please do feel to do that. What we do request in those formats is if you can send some information of name, contact information, general demographic, so we can have an idea of whether we're meeting our targets of engaging all the stakeholders that we need to. We also collect contact information as we go along, because one thing we do with our consultation strategy is make sure that after the consultation is finished, we'll send a synopsis of summarising the feedback that we received and also summarising the changes that we made in response to that feedback, so that everyone can be informed of what was different between the publication of the draft and the publication of version 16. And the timeline for version 16 publishing is that it will be published on the 1st of October 2022. And then there's 6 months for all stakeholders to get familiar with those changes, and it will be effective from the 1st of April 2023. If you'd like more information on how to get involved in the public consultation, then the best place to go to is the public consultation webpage. So I've got the webpage on the screen now, but I'll also just pop it into the chat box. So I would recommend if you can have a look at that. That will give you all the links to the surveys, the webinars, summaries, and all of our contact details too. So to move on to the topic of today's webinar, we're focusing on quite a big area and slightly different to the topic that we covered last week, which was carbon and plastics. So whereas that was a very requirement and quite concrete subject, our requirements on water and collaborative action are mostly trying to promote best practice, and we have some changes that are more in the line of recommended control points. Where we started off with this is we knew that we needed to strengthen our requirements on water management, particularly in regard to water quality. But when we started working on a water management project, one thing we kept on coming across and being aware of was the importance of water catchments and of working at landscape scale changes. And the more we researched landscape scale changes, the more we realised that actually this isn't just distinct to water management, this is distinct to and relevant to a lot of environmental features. So we split these out into two projects, of a water project focusing on water quality, and then a landscape scale change project thinking about wider impact that could be achieved through collaborative action. So they were the two distinct and separate projects. And with water management, the way that we approached this was firstly doing a literature review. We had a look at existing resources such as the WWF Water Stewardship Framework. And then we also did some stakeholder interviews, discussing our findings, discussing where was it appropriate for us to strengthen our requirements and how could we do that. And then once we developed our control points, we then went through a series of trial audits. So we would have the selection of control points that we developed. We would send them to an auditor and send them to a farm, and then we'd have a group discussion of whether those changes could be audited, if they're appropriate, if there were things that we've missed, and if our language could be improved. After that trial audit process, then that went through our technical advisory committee for their approval, and the control points that are in the Leaf Marque Standard version 16 draft are the result of that process. It was a really big topic for us to address, and there's also, we recognise that there's a lot of guidance and information and support that would be needed to achieve this. So our other outputs of this project included a podcast that our consultant Catherine Green produced for us, and also a guidance document on approaches to water management. So I'll pop those into the chat box as well if you were interested in it, but the links haven't worked. So I'll follow that up afterwards and to make sure that there's available, because they're really useful resources to have. So that was the water project. And then moving on to the landscape scale process. As I mentioned, this was an extension of the water monitoring project. So we started off with water monitoring, and then we focused firstly on catchment scale in the context of water, but then identified control points that could be more broadly applicable to this context. One of our key priorities was in developing this was achievability, and relevant to many groups, because what we do recognise is that some businesses will not be able to undertake collaborative action. It could be barriers of such as that there's no local groups around, it could be barriers of resource such as time and economics, and it could be the limitations of timescale and funding and a lack of effective facilitators. So when developing these control points, our priority was to focus on, well, we recognise that there's not one size fits all approach, but what can we do to encourage collaboration, given the benefits that it has both socially and environmentally. So we worked on this again with consultation with our partners, and this went again through the technical advisory committee for their approval. So I'll move on then to the detail of the changes that were made, and starting off with water management. So one of the things that I mentioned is focusing on pollution and how we can strengthen our requirements around that. And in version 15, which you can see on the left, there were 2 control points that we had relating to drainage ditches, monitoring of water courses, and maps of those drainage schemes for the farms. And we felt that to firstly improve clarity and concise of written of the standard, we could condense that into a single control point, but given the importance, we would update that to an essential control point. So within version 16, it's essentially the same requirements that were in version 15, slightly rephrased to make sure that they're still accessible, and they can be achievable in all contexts. But one thing to pull out that is different and to note is that we do specifically reference fire water runoff. So when we were discussing with in the trial audits and in the conversations that we had, it was apparent that in some cases we need to highlight more the importance of having reference to those maps and that they're available to the emergency services, just in recognition that if you have a fire, sometimes the biggest environmental damage isn't from the blaze itself, but it's from the pollution impacts that could come from the fire water that drains off. And if the availability of those maps that can be handed promptly in the case of an emergency, then that can help support and avoid those events. So that's condensing those 2 control points into one, a similar sort of message, again, promoting the importance of those maps, and including making sure that they're up to date and available in the case of emergencies. The next change within the water management section is update to the water management plan. On the screen, you'll see what's included in the draft for version 16. And the text in orange is the new text that's suggested for version 16. One thing to note about this is the water management section is perhaps one of the most challenging sections to have it applicable to all contexts. One thing that we do when we're writing the standard is that we're aware that we need to write this so that it's relevant to all businesses, regardless of where they are and regardless of their enterprise type. But particularly in terms of location in country and region, time of year, water availability varies significantly. So the way that we've addressed that is including the phrase that the water management plan is proportionate to water use. So the detail and the complexity of a water management plan will vary between contexts. Businesses where they have very little rainfall, for example, it will look very different to a water management plan in this country, for example. So that's something that we're doing to try and mitigate the fact that it's, again, not a one size fits all, but it's the consideration of these factors that are important. You'll note that we've got a reference to water catchment here, again, just because it's impossible really to talk about water and not reference that in the same way. And again, it's that focus on making sure that there's the water distribution map, so that planning, that understanding of the baseline system of what is the business got currently that is so important to any future plans then moving forward. So that's what we've done for mainly this one. Another thing to pull out is there's a lot of almost thinking ahead into the future. So what I've mentioned in terms of the maps and water catchment can often be an immediate reaction and a responsive reaction to the environment now. But what can be done to think about how water management might change in the future and what needs to be done to prepare for that? So the last text in orange says consideration of water use related to local availability and future demand. So we're just trying to put these references to thinking ahead. What can we do to, if we think that droughts are going to become more often, or if you think extreme rainfall events are becoming more often, what can be done to reference that and to help adapt to that? We've used the phrase consideration, and this is something in terms of auditing, the expectation would be that the auditor is looking for evidence that this has been thought of, that there might be a list of strategies that could be due to address that. And it would be fine if none of those strategies are possible in this year, but it just shows consideration and shows that process of thought. And there's various ways that can be evidenced. Given that it's a record and observational, it's most likely going to be some sort of records that could be even mapping about future demand, some sort of evaluation of that. But that would be very helpful, I think, in terms of auditing. That's the sort of thing that will be discussed as well with the auditor. That's the water management plan. And then lastly, on water management changes, is referencing 2 new control points that we've introduced. Both of these are recommended. So recommended control points are either control points that are not applicable to all contexts, and therefore they will always remain to be recommended, or they're control points that we recognise there may be constraints at the time due to limited technology or accessibility that mean they're not appropriate to make essential in that first year, but they may become essential in future years. So, for example, I would imagine that in future years, when there's more information of water quality monitoring, that would become essential. But for version 16, it's recommended. And the intention is that it's really both of these measures are having a consideration and recognition of current water use that then enables plans to be made and strategies to be made to either monitor that and ensure it remains the same, minimises any negative impacts, or can be improved. In terms of the justification of water sources, as I mentioned, the justification, what the auditor will be looking for there is either a discussion and explanation of what thought is being given to this and why they feel that's appropriate. And that can include then the bullet points that are referenced within that control point. So refer to that when collecting evidence for that. But it can also be any sort of records that are justifying that the water use is why it's being used in that way. And then water quality monitoring, we've written this to enable any form of water quality monitoring to be relevant. It's a hugely complex and often challenging thing to monitor that could be done at different scales, different times, different methods with different focuses. What we're not saying is that there's one that is better than another, because what is relevant and achievable will vary between different farms. So what we want to do is have that process of, okay, what can we do in our context to monitor that? And that could be outsourcing it if the resources allow, or it could be working as part of a group where there's other expertise that can be brought in, or it can be highly complex or simple solutions within that farm business. It's up to them to decide. They will have a discussion with the auditor, or it can be documented in the water quality monitoring records of why that's chosen. And again, it's the focus of, in order to make improvements, you first need to understand where the current baseline is of the business, and then building on that where possible. But again, it's recommended, it's written in a way we're hoping that is accessible to all businesses, and ultimately it's up to the business to decide what is relevant water quality monitoring in their business if they're able to do so for version 16. That covers off water management. And then the other control points to reference to this second project that I mentioned are landscape scale impacts. And the strategy to achieve that was through collaborative action. So these are in the organisation and planning section, just because it's relevant to all sections potentially of integrated farm management. So it didn't feel right just to put it in water management, because it could have relevance to things like pollution control management. So that's why it's in that section. And again, the key focus is on these being achievable. They're both recommended control points, because we recognise that there's some contexts where this will not be possible. And the approach that we took was almost a two-pronged approach, where firstly, control point 1.22 is thinking about the act of collaborating with others, whereas 1.23 is thinking about the impact of that collective action. So you could almost think it, splitting it into a practice-based control point in 1.22 and an outcome-based control point in 1.23. Again, there's a degree of flexibility here, and any type of collaboration is beneficial, and it will vary on the context. So it's up to the business to decide, well, who are my available businesses or farmers or colleagues that we could collaborate with, and that could be research, or it could be if you have, say, you can collate your plastic to be recycled more effectively. If you're working as a wider scale with other farmers too, that can be relevant, because we don't want to say that there's one sort of collaboration that's better than another. It's all really important. It all can have impact, and starting somewhere can be great. And also, if you do one sort of collaboration, that doesn't mean that you can't do a different sort of collaboration in the next year. We have got reference there to water, labour, training, just to give some prompts of where could be a starting point. But again, those aren't, they don't need to be, it's not limited to just those factors. It can be much broader than that. And as I mentioned, control point 1.23, and that's focusing on the outcome of that collaboration. What is the collective action that's happening within that collaborative group to have an impact? And it's a really focusing on the intentional delivery. So it's not collaborating because it's in the process, but it's collaborating because it's having a collective action, and that's the destination and intention of that group. So that's a very quick run through of those changes. Again, as I mentioned, they're in the summaries described there, and you can also find those in the draft standards if you wanted to see how they fit into the wider context of the Leaf Marque standard.